What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. So if you've watched my channel for any time now, I'm sure you know that I love football jigs and I love throwing them on offshore structure. And a lot of guys that I do lessons with and that I talk to in my virtual lessons struggle with catching fish on jigs, especially jigs offshore. And so today I want to talk to you about 3 reasons why I believe I catch more fish on jigs than the average bass fisherman, and give you some tips that will help you improve your offshore jig fishing this winter into the spring. So the first reason that I think I catch more fish on jigs offshore than the average angler is because I always have my jig in contact with the bottom and I know where my jig is in the water column at all times. And for new fishermen, especially people who are just starting to fish offshore, one of the most common mistakes I see in my on-the-water lessons and just fishing with people in general is that their bait isn't on the bottom, whether that's a crankbait, a jig, any bait. And especially with a jig, you need to have bottom contact with your bait. You need to have that bait digging into the bottom, or at least being within a few feet of the bottom to get those fish to bite. And there's a couple ways that I make sure that my bait's on the bottom, and there are things that you need to be doing if you're fishing a jig offshore. So the first thing you can do to ensure your jig is on the bottom when you're fishing offshore is by using a heavier jig. This is a 3/4 ounce football jig, and I throw a 3/4 ounce football head jig anytime I'm fishing deeper than 10 feet of water. And then I'll throw a 1/2 ounce football head jig when I'm fishing less than 10 feet of water. And I really like a football head jig when fishing offshore just because it has that football shape, it comes through rocks and brush piles really well, and it also kind of digs into the rocks a little bit, helping me feel the bottom a little bit better. And so by using a little bit heavier jig, I ensure that my bait's going to get down to the bottom fast and stay there. The next thing you need to do is make sure you have patience when you're fishing a jig offshore. Even though this jig is 3/4 ounce and it's pretty heavy, it still takes 5 to 10 seconds, maybe even 20 seconds for that bait to get down to the bottom. And so if I'm fishing off this point, for example, I'm gonna throw my jig out there and it may take me 15 seconds to get that jig to hit the bottom. Now, how do you know your jig has hit the bottom? Well, the easiest way to know is to actually watch your slack line coming from your pole to the water. And if your line is still moving forward into the water, that's gonna mean that your jig is still falling. If your line, when you lay it on the water, is completely coiled up and slack, and you can just whip the line like that, that means that that jig has finished falling. But if it has any kind of tightness in it, if it's still kind of running straight into the water and you can see it moving, that jig hasn't hit the bottom yet. And so once that jig is down there, then what I want to do is I actually want to drag that jig to the side. And what that does is it'll actually let me feel any rocks or any hard things that are down there. And you can see right there, I'm actually hung on the bottom. And so you know that you're on the bottom then by dragging that jig on the side and feeling whatever is down there. And then the last thing you can do to ensure that your jig is making its way all the way to the bottom when you cast it in an offshore area is to give your bait slack line as it's falling. And the easiest way to do that, honestly, is when you make your cast that bait out there, leave your spool disengaged, and then bring the rod behind your head, and then you can kind of flick that slack line forward. What that does is it creates a lot of spare line right here, and that's going to allow that jig to fall straight down to the bottom. You don't want that jig falling on a tight line. Oh my goodness, I'm really down on the bottom now. But you don't want that bait falling on a tight line, because what that'll do is it'll cause that bait to pendulum down, and it will basically only go about half as far as you actually want it to go. And if you give it slack line, that jig will fall straight down to the bottom, and it will stay on the bottom a lot longer throughout your entire cast. The second reason why I believe I catch more fish on a jig offshore than the average angler is because I can detect the bite on this jig better than your average fisherman. And one reason why I believe people struggle with jig fishing, especially jig fishing offshore, is because they actually don't detect the bites on the jig. And so they may get 10 or 15 bites over the course of a day and only detect 1 or 2 of them, or they might get 5 bites and detect none of them and say, man, jigs are terrible, I'm gonna throw them in the bottom of the tackle box and never pick them up again. And so I find that when I do on-the-water fishing lessons with guys, we may go jig fishing offshore and I might catch 10, 15 fish, and the guy I'm with may only catch 1 or 2 fish. And the fish that the guy I'm with catches has the jig way down in the bottom of its throat. It basically is choking the jig, and the only fish you're catching are the ones that literally they can't help catch because they swallow the jig. The rest of the fish that just barely tick the bait or that hold the bait but you don't really feel a strike that well, they're missing, they're not setting the hook. And so a lot of times I believe that people aren't catching fish on jigs because they're just not detecting the bite. So one easy way to improve your bite detection is by using the right equipment for offshore jig fishing. And whenever I'm fishing a jig offshore, I'm going to be using fluorocarbon line. Fluorocarbon line is a lot more sensitive than monofilament line, and I'll use either 14 or 17 pound fluorocarbon. And it doesn't really matter if it's cheap fluorocarbon or expensive fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon in general though just gives you a better feel. And the other thing you can do is use a little bit higher quality rod. So I actually use the Quantum Smoke S3 rods, and they're $150, but they're really sensitive and I can feel everything that's going on with my jig using that fluorocarbon and using my fishing pole. And so if you're having trouble even feeling your jig down there, even when you're using a 3/4 ounce jig and you know your bait's in the bottom, it's probably because your equipment isn't quite right to allow you to feel that jig the best you can. The next thing you can do is improve your ability to differentiate when you're dragging your jig up against cover and when a fish actually has it in its mouth. And so if you take a look at this bank in front of me, we have some standing timber that's out here as well as some rocks. And so if I cast this jig out there, there's a pretty good chance that with that 3/4 ounce jig, I'm gonna be dragging up against some sort of cover during that cast. And I find that a lot of guys struggle to differentiate between cover and bass. And a lot of times actually, I find that guys are setting the hook on rocks and trees and they're shaking off fish. And a lot of times I see guys literally shaking the rod like this, like, man, come off there, and a fish will jump up out of the water with their bait in their mouth. And some of you guys are gonna laugh and say, oh man, they're terrible at fishing, but that's super common with all fishermen. And until you understand the feeling of what a jig bite feels like, it happens to everyone. It happened to me when I was younger. So don't worry about being ashamed of, like, oh man, I didn't know that was a fish, or being scared to set the hook because you think you're gonna lose your jig. A lot of jig fishing is setting the hook on trees and rocks, stuff like that, so you learn that sensation. But one thing you can do to actually avoid setting the hook on cover and making sure you're setting the hook on fish is whenever you pull up your jig to some sort of impasse, let's say, you can't move your jig forward. You're like, what is that? I'm not really sure. And you can't tell 100% what's down there. First thing I always do is I am going to first make sure that I reel down to whatever my jig's pulled up against and make sure my line is completely tight. Then I'm gonna pull up for 3 seconds. So right there, I pulled up for just a second and that jig hopped over that rock. But I might find that I pull up 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds. And if you pull up for 4 seconds and you don't feel one of the following 3 things, you're probably hung on a rock or a piece of wood. The first thing you're gonna feel is the classic thud, or you're gonna feel that fish actually pulling your rod back down. And so as you're pulling it up, your rod's getting then pulled back down. That means that's a fish, set the hook. That's the easiest one to tell. The second thing you're gonna feel is you'll actually feel your line moving to the right, to the left, or it's gonna be moving towards you. And so that's a little bit harder to distinguish, especially when you first learn to fish. But what you'll find is that as you're holding that jig, all of a sudden it feels like your line's drifting to the right or drifting to the left. And if your boat's not moving and it's not super windy, a lot of times that means that's a fish as well. And then the last thing you're gonna feel is you may feel like your jig is almost weightless. And so you're lifting up, you're lifting up, you're lifting up, and you don't feel the weight of that jig. For whatever reason, you can't move, I guess, the bait, but for whatever reason, like you're moving it, and it feels like it's just nothing's there. There's no weight of the jig, there's no pull back, or it doesn't feel like it's hung up against something hard. And when you have that weightless feeling, that's also going to be a fish. And so you're either gonna have the classic thud or the fish pulling on it. You're gonna feel that line moving left or right or towards you, or you're going to feel the bait being weightless. And usually with a jig offshore, I find that that weightless feeling is the most common feeling. It's like the fish actually came by, your jig's on the bottom, it picked it up, and it's now swimming away or maybe swimming towards you. And you pull up that rod, you don't feel anything for even just half a second or a second, and you set the hook. And it takes a little bit of time to kind of get a feel for that. Nowadays, when a fish has the jig in its mouth, my jig at least, I know it almost immediately just because I've caught thousands and thousands of fish on a 3/4 ounce football jig over the years. But when I was first learning, a lot of times I wouldn't set the hook on the jig at all, and the fish would have the jig completely swallowed in its mouth. And so a lot of times it just takes a lot of patience, a lot of practice to figure out what's a fish, what's not a fish. But those are 3 ways I actually can explain what a bite feels like. It's probably one of the hardest things to do. I've tried to figure out how to explain what a bite feels like over years. I've tried to figure out how to put it into words, and I'm still gonna work on that, guys, and I'll try to make a video on that at some point, but for now, that's the best I can do until I come up with a better way to explain it. And then the last way you can improve your ability to detect a bite is if you think you have a bite, set the hook. The worst thing you're gonna do is you're gonna lose a jig, but a lot of times losing a jig is a lot better than losing a 4 or 5 pound bass. And once you set the hook on a brush pile or a rock pile 10, 15 times and lose 5 or 6 jigs, you're gonna start understanding what that rock pile, what that brush pile feels like. And so make sure you're really paying attention to when you do set the hook, what are you setting the hook on? Why are you setting the hook? Don't just set the hook just because. Make sure that when, again, you feel whatever it is down there, pull your rod up for 3, 4, 5 seconds and really examine what you're feeling. Do you feel that weightlessness? Do you feel it just being hard, like you can't move it at all? Does it feel like it's moving to the side? Whatever it is. And again, if you pull up and you're pulling up for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, and nothing's happening, it's just completely tight, it's probably because you're up against some sort of rock, some sort of brush. And so in that case, what I like to do then is I pull up, 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 and I can't let it go, and then all I'll do is I'll just kind of pop my rod like that. And worst case scenario, you pop your rod like that and the fish eats it, and then you set the hook. But a lot of times, you're just gonna pop it over some sort of rock or some sort of brush that you're in. So the last reason why I believe I catch more fish on a jig offshore than the average bass fisherman is because I use a lot of different retrieves when I'm fishing a jig offshore. So I typically use 4 different retrieves when I'm fishing my football jig, and I may use 2 or 3 different retrieves within one cast. And so I'm gonna walk you through all 4 retrieves I use day in and day out when fishing a jig offshore. The first retrieve I use when I cast my jig out there is to let it sink to the bottom and then point my rod to the side and just slowly drag that jig along the bottom. And this is kind of the standard retrieve when fishing a football jig. Just barely crawling that jig down the bottom. I might shake my rod a little bit like that. Just kind of feeling every single rock. I like to call it counting rocks, basically. You want to feel every single rock you're coming against, every single brush pile, everything like that. And so I'm just putting the rod to the side and slowly dragging it. And that's how 80% of bass fishermen fish a jig offshore when they try to do it. Now, one thing I will say is that I always prefer to drag the jig to the side as opposed to dragging the jig up in this direction. The main reason for that is when I'm dragging the jig with my rod going up, I'm actually pulling the jig up off the bottom, and I'm losing bottom contact and not feeling what's going on down the bottom. And when I'm fishing a football jig especially, or any jig offshore, I really like to make sure when I'm trying to drag that jig that I'm keeping bottom contact at all times, and I want to feel everything that's going on down there. There are other retrieves I use when I want to actually work that jig up off the bottom, but when I'm trying to actually work that jig on the bottom, always work your rod to the side, not straight up, and that'll help you keep that bait down there a lot better. The next retrieve I use when I throw my jig out there is a fast drag, and this is actually my go-to retrieve and the one I use probably 70% of the time. And all I'm basically doing is I'm going to drag that jig to the side, put my rod forward, make sure it hits the bottom, and then drag it again. Let it hit the bottom again, and then drag it like this. And basically, I'm dragging it just slow enough to maintain bottom contact, but basically I'm trying to drag it as quickly as I can while maintaining bottom contact. And what that does is it a lot of times will create a nice reaction strike out of those fish. That jig is going to be moving pretty quickly across the bottom, hopping across the bottom, and I find that I fish my football jigs a lot faster than the average angler, and I catch a ton of good fish offshore doing this. And so I think that by fishing that jig a little bit quicker a lot of times, I can get some good bites. And again, the trick with this retrieve is to ensure you have bottom contact even though you're dragging that jig quickly. And so I'm going to be using that side drag approach, and instead of counting rocks where you're just barely moving that rod, just counting it, fishing it real slow like a lot of guys would, I'm literally like pulling that jig almost across the bottom. Now when you're fishing really deep, a lot of times you can't pull that jig too far, too fast, because it'll actually pull the jig up off the bottom, or if it's going down a slope, it'll pull it too far off the bottom. So you kind of have to play it by ear a little bit, but as long as I make sure I'm feeling those rocks down there, I'll drag that jig pretty quickly to the side, and I feel like I get a lot of reaction strikes and a lot of good bites using this retrieve. The next retrieve I use is just a slight variation to the slow drag I just showed you. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add some rod twitches as I'm dragging that jig back. And all I'm basically doing is dragging that jig and then twitching my rod 2, 3, 4 times. And what it'll do is it'll give a little bit extra action to that jig, kind of hop it into the rocks a little bit quicker, hop it off the bottom just a little bit more, maybe stir up a little bit more dirt on the bottom, stuff like that. And I don't do it every single time I drag the jig. I might drag the jig twice normally with that kind of slow or that quicker drag. And then the third or fourth time, I'll give it 3 or 4 little jerks like that. And a lot of times I find that that is what triggers the bite. A lot of times I'll be dragging that jig slow and I'm thinking that fish is just kind of following the jig, and all of a sudden I do the 3 little twitches, it'll skip that jig forward just a little bit further, and that fish reacts to it. And so it's just a little nuance, a little small change of the retrieve that can have a really big impact. And then the last retrieve I do is called stroking a jig. And this is a very specialized technique that I don't use all the time. I really do it when I feel like the fish are in active feeding mode and I feel like they're kind of aggressive and they might be chasing shad or chasing bait fish. And basically all it is casting that jig out there, letting it sink to the bottom, and then ripping that jig up off the bottom and letting it fall back down. And you want to make sure that jig gets all the way back to the bottom. Then all I'm going to do is just twitch my rod up in the air like that 2 times, which is going to hop that jig straight up in the air, and then it'll fall right back down to the bottom. And again, you don't want to hop that jig, let it fall for a second, and then keep hopping it, because that jig's never going to make its way back to the bottom. You always want to make sure the jig goes all the way back to the bottom before you stroke that jig again. And sometimes, again, I'll add the stroking the jig technique into my regular pulling motion. So I might pull the jig like this, pull it kind of slow, then I get to a little bit shallower water, I'll start pulling it a little bit quicker. Then I might do the 1, 2, 3 little jerks. Then at some point in the retrieve I might do a little stroking action. That sounded weird. I might stroke the jig a little bit and pop that jig off the bottom and kind of put all 4 retrieves into one cast. And so a lot of times I am constantly adjusting and changing how I'm reeling in that jig, how I'm bringing it back to the boat. And pretty much all cases I'm dragging that jig to the side, except for when I'm hopping that jig or stroking the jig. And so those are 3 ways that I retrieve my jig, or 4 ways actually that I retrieve my jig, that I believe help me put a lot more fish in the boat than the average bass fisherman. And so if you're fishing your jig offshore and you're not changing up your retrieve, you're definitely leaving bites on the lake. So guys, that's it. Those are 3 reasons why I believe I catch more fish on a jig offshore than your average bass fisherman. And these tips are just things that I've learned over the years, and there may be other better ways to retrieve a jig, to fish a jig that I don't even know about yet, and I might be sharing those in the future as I learn them. But for now, this is what I believe helps me catch a lot of good fish, and so maybe applying a couple of those things I talked about will help you as well. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that one of the major reasons I think I catch more fish on a jig than the average fisherman is because I throw a jig all the time, whether offshore or up shallow. I believe a jig is the most versatile fishing lure out there. You can fish it in 6 inches of water or 60 feet of water, and you can throw it in a lot of different sizes, colors, shapes, things like that. And so I really like a jig, and it's my #1 confidence bait. So if you haven't fished a jig before and you're struggling to get bites on them, struggling to feel bites, just put one in your hand, lock it in your hand for 2-3 days in a row. Maybe spend 2 months just only fishing jigs. I guarantee you, if you do that, the size of your fish is going to improve, because all my biggest fish I catch throughout a year are on either a football jig, a swim jig, or a flipping jig. Probably at least 80% of them. And I've actually made a video on that before, and you can check it up here in the corner. And so that's my statistics on all the fishing lures I throw throughout the year and what catches me the biggest fish. And so definitely check out a jig if you haven't already, and also again follow the tips if you want to catch some more fish offshore on jigs. So thanks again for checking out this video, guys. Hope it was helpful, and hope I'll see you in the next one. See you guys.